My name is Kelsey Swift, and thank you for tuning into my talk entitled Standardization in Practice, Raciolinguistic Ideologies in Adult English Education, Then and Now. I am a PhD candidate in linguistics at the CUNY, or City University of New York, Graduate Center, and I also teach at Lehman College and City College in the CUNY system. My email and Twitter handle are at the bottom of the screen and will be shared again at the end of the presentation. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or comments or otherwise want to connect. I am speaking to you from Brooklyn, New York, also known as Lenapehoking, the unceded land of the Lenape people. This land has also been known as Weeksville, one of the largest liberated Black communities in the pre-Civil War United States. Though this community's relationship to the land is different, I will also name the people of Weeksville as stewards of this land. This framing is especially important when discussing adult education, as we will today. My background is in adult education, and I come to this conversation as a researcher and a practitioner looking to interrogate the legacy of colonialism in this field while recognizing my own complicity as a white person from the United States. Specifically, I'm interested in what English we're teaching in contemporary adult ESL classrooms and how that idea of English is constructed. This question is part of a larger project that incorporates ethnography and critical discourse analysis, though I'll be focusing particularly on the treatment of linguistic features today. My conceptual framework is informed by work in standard language ideologies, as well as work in the ideological construction of languages and work in raciolinguistics. I'm also building on work in classroom ethnography and discourse analysis. The first part of my project is rooted in a classroom ethnography at an organization I'll call NYC.org. I observed 2 ESL classes within their adult education program over the course of 3 semesters, though I'm going to be focusing mostly on spring 2018, the first of those semesters. So as you might imagine, I found evidence of standard language ideologies coexisting with otherwise progressive values. There are a lot of themes I can talk about related to that, and I do elsewhere, but today I want to focus specifically on the designation of target forms, so how these specific linguistic features were treated in the class. I saw that linguistic boundaries were drawn through the designation of targets and the censoring of other forms. And so this was done through the things like explicit correction, exaggerated modeling, and metalinguistic commentary. And within this, certain features received extra attention. They were attended to over and over again in every class, regardless of the stated objective of the lesson. So these are final sounds, inflectional morphology or inflectional morphemes, and interdental fricatives. So the first 2 categories have some overlap. I'll have some examples here from the classroom discourse. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can pause and look through them. But we see here some that kind of qualify as both final sounds and inflectional morphemes, so things like the ED or the dove morpheme or the final S, where other final sounds do not overlap with inflectional morphology, like in this example where a teacher is correcting a student saying, in English, we say the final consonant, tomas. Then we have some other examples that have to do with inflectional morphology and verbal inflection in particular, which are not involving final sounds. So like example 6 with the teacher saying, can I say IB? Or a lot of people want to say was you, which is wrong. Then for the last category, the interdental fricatives, these were the phonemes or kind of category phoneme that got the most attention throughout both classes. This was repeated over and over again. And so these are some examples. Sometimes teacher is modeling something in response to a production from the students. Sometimes it's unprompted, but this recurred over the course of all 3 semesters in both classes, also in the curricular texts. The textbooks followed similar patterns, particularly in terms of inflectional morphology, which was focused within every lesson, or wouldn't say every lesson, but every unit in the text, regardless of what it says, kind of the objective was always a focus on inflectional morphology. So this stood out to me because it didn't seem to be about intelligibility. In fact, in the examples that I cited, the teachers always seemed to understand what the students were saying. And students focus on other phenomena when they were giving feedback to each other. So I was wondering, why do these forms get so much attention? Maybe unsurprisingly, these features of focus are associated with racialized varieties. Final consonant deletion and variant verb forms in present tense and th stopping have all been noted in linguistic descriptions of non-standard or so-called non-standard varieties, especially African American language and Chicanx or Latinx English. This association between language and race, particularly non-standardness and race, are reinforced through the coded racial references in teachers' metalinguistic and metapragmatic commentary. So these are some examples that I cited earlier where teacher is saying things like, a lot of people want to say was you, which is wrong. Or so kind of talking about this English and labeling it as wrong or not good English, that there's an English, but it's not the right English. And then this last example where the teacher says there are people who are born here and speak English, but don't pronounce it very well is notable because here it is clear that this inappropriateness or kind of not goodness of English is not about foreignness or cross-linguistic transfer or learning effect. That there are people who are native English speakers but do not use good English. And then we have other examples where the racial aspect is more overt, where teachers are using this kind of coded racial language, like street language or street English, which is both racialized and seems particularly connected to anti-Blackness because of the association between Blackness and urban space. And then this is also reinforced through the focus on the word ain't, which is characteristic of Black English, particularly in New York City, or associated with Black English in New York City. It doesn't really seem to be something that you would expect somebody to produce as an effect of their learning English, unless they're learning it from someone else who is a speaker of English. Similarly, white varieties of English were treated differently. There was limited discussion of variation in the classes, but the few variants introduced were explicitly linked to regional, not racialized varieties. So things like Southern English, Brooklyn English, or British English. The effect of this is that this excludes community language practices, which is really harmful in that it stigmatizes and delegitimizes the practices of communities that these learners live in, work in, likely identify with, and creates a disconnect between the community and what's happening outside of the classroom and what they're learning in the class, which really has negative consequences for learning. Also reinscribes the connection between race and language, and particularly whiteness in standard English, which should be really troubling if we care about anti-racism in our teaching or kind of challenging linguistic hierarchies. But where did this standard English come from? I don't expect or think that these teachers made it up themselves. I recognize it from other places. So I became interested in kind of the historical development of this idea of the standard. So this is the part of my project that's more in progress. I am in the process of doing a critical discourse analysis of historical ESL and English teaching materials and popular writings about English variation. And so I'm going to show you some of the highlights so far. Again, I'm going to show you lots of photos or screenshots of these texts. I'm not going to have the time to read all of them, but you are welcome to pause the video and read them. And if you need the text in a different format, please feel free to reach out to me. So I spent a lot of time looking at many different books. Again, I'm just going to give you the highlights. When I looked at books that were used at the kind of end of the 20th century, I saw a lot of very similar things as the books that were used in the contemporary classes, which is not surprising because there's some time overlap. These books, the books that were used in contemporary classes were Future and Side by Side. One of them was from the early 21st century, and one was first produced in the 80s. So not surprising that there's overlap. So I was interested in looking further back. And so one of the books I focused on was the first book in American English, which was widely used in the mid 20th century. So here we see lots of focus on verbal paradigm. This is familiar, similar to what we're seeing in the contemporary curriculum. We can see a periodic focus on specific sounds, especially we see the TH sound again. And then some other sounds that are a little different than what we see in the contemporary classes. So we see focus on vowels like A and the centralized And then also a focus on final sounds, which looks familiar, especially the final S. And then some final clusters, so X and St, being kind of their own standalone lessons. And so we see in that kind of mid-century example, things look very similar, familiar to what we're seeing in the contemporary classroom. So I wanted to go back further. And so looking at a text that was used in many settlement houses and other early kind of institutions of immigrant education. So like this is English for Coming Citizens from 1918. And this looks different. We see a focus on vocabulary acquisition rather than grammar. Lessons are organized around context and or communicative acts explicitly and with really no kind of grammar goals included in that organization. Very little review of grammatical forms. There's some attention to word form later in later lessons, but not a lot. There is also more attention to written style in later lessons. And overall, very little mention of non-target forms, but a notable exception is from lesson 76. We see here is we never say you is or you was, something that sounds like we could hear in the contemporary classes. But otherwise, not a lot of material like this. There's no explicit focus on phonics or pronunciations in the lessons, but the appendix provides a few activities. So here we see a focus on w versus v. We also see the th sound, the interdental will come up. And then we see some other sounds that really don't come up in contemporary teaching. So the distinction between j and ch. We see focus on the velar nasal, which I was actually surprised to not see more focus on that within the classrooms or the text that they were using in the contemporary moment, but it really wasn't there, but we do see it here. And then also some voicing contrast with da and ta and pa and ba. So I want to take a second to note that even though I pulled out those examples, really that was at the very end of the book. Most of the book is not focused on grammar, but we do have those limited examples. And similar book, English for Coming Americans from 1910, and overall quite similar. It focuses on speaking and vocabulary acquisition, organized around practical themes. It focuses on personal actions. There are some grammatical lessons focused on verb forms, which the book calls the greatest difficulty for foreigners, and also lessons on pronouns. But again, these are kind of peripheral to the more thematic or vocabulary focused lessons. So variation in pronoun use in the book is considered typical foreign speech. We see this in these representations of learner language. Variation in inflection is also considered foreign. So here the book describes this not being an issue for even illiterate people. So people that we kind of see as socially stigmatized or maybe with low education, but that is really something that's confined to foreigners. Foreign language in general is seen as the primary source of contamination. There's not really any, there's a lot of talk about foreign language and foreigners, but nothing really about other varieties of English that are native to the United States. There's very limited attention to pronunciation, except for some mention of th and w versus v, which we saw in the last book as well. So we see in ESL over time, earlier education focused on cultural and social practices. Language is treated as a whole entity. Of course, they are there to learn English. It is an English class, but English is seen as kind of as a vehicle to be able to learn these cultural and social practices that will make you into a mainstream American. And language is treated as kind of another cultural practice along with that. There's less focus on specific features. We do still see some similar examples of pathologization, not as much, but we see some of it, but it's tied to foreignness rather than kind of non-standardness or racialized groups. If we think beyond ESL, we can think about the other early institutions focused on the education of racialized people. There's a lot to say about the education of African Americans and the role that language played in the subjugation of enslaved African people in the United States. And I will talk about that elsewhere, but I'm not going to get into that today. I do want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the education of Indigenous people, particularly at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was founded in 1879, is a well-known and horrific example of education of Indigenous children. It was a boarding school, and children were removed from their homes and isolated from their communities. Here, education was used as a tool of cultural genocide to erase the cultural practices of Indigenous peoples of the United States. There was a lot of focus on kind of acquiring new mainstream American cultural practice and to be shaped into participation into a capitalist economy. And we also see that learning English in particular is a priority, the replacement of Indigenous languages with English. But even though English is a priority and many of the students in these schools spoke Indigenous languages, they did not use curriculum that was specifically designed for speakers of other languages. They used the same curriculum that was being used in public schooling for native English speakers. And so one example is Tarbell's Lessons in Language, which was proposed for use at the Carlisle School Unclear if it was actually adopted, but is representative of text use at the time. Here, so it's designed for native speakers. It gives some insight into the more general language ideologies of the time. It has a grammatical focus from the beginning, from the very first lesson, both on replicating forms and meta-linguistic knowledge of grammar, focuses on writing. We see some familiar standard language lessons that you might recognize from your own education. But then it has these other features that are focused on, that are different from the immigrant educational texts that we see at a similar time period in the early 20th century, but seem more similar to what we're seeing in the contemporary classroom. So the censoring of the word ain't, we see lots of focus on singular versus plural verb forms. We see some treatment of voicing contrast, especially final sounds. We see N versus the velar, ng. And then we see this kind of statement about negation being a particular issue for speakers of English in the United States, and presumably we're talking about multiple negation. So we see many of the same features that surface in contemporary ESL teaching, but these features are associated with native white English speakers. These similar features are noted in Mencken's The American Language, which is was an influential work of kind of descriptive linguistics in 1919. Mencken notes common American features like ain't, multiple negatives, and invariant verb forms like in he, don't care. He describes these as being spread throughout the country, not associated with a specific region. You see them coast to coast. One hears it everywhere. He also talks about final devoicing, cluster reduction, or cluster simplification and deletion. You can see some examples of that are also widespread throughout the United States. And then he has a brief mention of race as a source of variation. So this is another, again, focusing on kind of deletion and cluster simplification. And here, even though he had earlier said it's widespread in the United States, he also ties it to national speech, but also being influenced through Southern dialect, which in turn he's proposing that it derives from the linguistic practices of Black people. But that is the only mention of race in really, or that type of mention of race in the entire book. Though if we fast forward 30 years to 1948, Mencken publishes Supplement 2, which is a supplement to the American Language, his earlier work, with a radically different description. Here he's talking about African-American Creole, or what he would consider African-American Creole, and he's talking about it as being the source of these features that are specific to African Americans. He calls them grammatical peculiarities seldom encountered in white Southern speech. And what is shocking here is that he references some of the exact same features that he talks about in 1919, but says they're particular to African American speech. Here he has some examples of kind of these verbal inflection patterns, and then he also goes on to talk about phonology. We see similar shift in other popular writings in the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. Non-standard forms become racialized and particularly associated with Blackness. This parallels the shift described by Bonfiglio when he's discussing the treatment of R, and particularly R dropping in Race and the Rise of Standard American. So we're seeing these are different features. There's actually no mention of R really in any of this material, but a similar phenomenon where we see an increased racial anxiety influencing ideas of standardness and causing a reevaluation of features as they become registered with different populations. So my conclusions, are really kind of my tentative proposals, or my ideas in progress, are that race and language are inherently connected, but this relationship has shifted over time. In earlier time periods, we see English as a whole connected to whiteness, so the whole language or languages are racialized. Later, particular Englishes are connected to whiteness, so individual features are being racialized. And I am guessing from the time period and the dates, this is caused by changing social conditions, especially the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the Northern United States and to the West as well. And we also see that changes in social and political conditions affect the role of education and how language education plays out. What that means for today is that contemporary teaching is shaped by a history of linguistic anti-Blackness, which is something that we need to seriously contend with if we want to practice anti-racist teaching, or if we want to disrupt racial hierarchies in our classrooms or beyond. So next steps will be continued discourse analysis, including non-curricular texts, and hopefully some discussion. Please reach out if you have questions, comments, critiques. I would love to work through these ideas with you. Thank you for tuning in, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.